On a quiet evening, as the world around us stills, much like an ancient scroll unfurling before our eyes, we embark on a leisurely and immersive journey through realms where reality intertwined with myth. These are tales that have whispered for centuries through the branches of olive groves and echoed in the colonnades of forgotten temples, passed down from generation to generation like secret messages reaching us through the mists of time. Allow the day's hustle to dissolve into the gathering twilight, like the morning mist melting over the azure waters of the Aegean Sea. Let the subdued lighting and soft background hum create an atmosphere where every detail comes alive, and imagination paints scenes of an era when gods walked the earth alongside mortals, and every legend held a grain of truth, enveloped in magic. In the sun-drenched meadows of ancient Sicily, where wildflowers bloomed like a vibrant tapestry, woven by an unseen artist, a young maiden named Persephone spent her days engaged in an activity that at first glance might seem remarkably ordinary. She gathered flowers, but her movements were not hurried or careless, as if one were simply plucking a dandelion from a garden. No, Persephone glided through these fields like a gentle breeze, her bare feet barely disturbing the morning dew. She knelt among clusters of narcissus, their snowy petals catching the first rays of the sun, and with meticulous selectivity chose only the most flawless specimens. Her woven basket gradually filled with hyacinths, roses, and violets, which seemed to emit an inner luminescence. You can almost smell the sweetness hanging in the air, can't you? That intoxicating bouquet of honey and fresh grass, the aroma of spring dawns, when everything feels new and full of boundless possibilities. Persephone's mother, Demeter, was the powerful goddess of the harvest, and together they bestowed upon the world its vibrant bloom. It was a life filled with peace and tranquility, predictable as the unchanging seasons, comforting, reliable, and safe. However, on that particular morning, as Persephone ventured further than her usual paths, something extraordinary caught her eye. A single narcissus flower, surpassing in size and beauty anything she had ever seen, grew in a small, secluded clearing. Its petals seemed to shimmer like pearls, and its fragrance beckoned her forward with an irresistible force, as if someone had called her name. What Persephone did not know, and could not have known, was that this flower had been placed there deliberately, deep beneath the earth, in caverns so vast and hidden that sunlight never touched their walls. Hades, the lord of the underworld, ruled this realm. He was not evil or cruel, as he is sometimes depicted in tales. He was simply lonely. Imagine an eternity spent in a place where nothing grew, nothing changed, nothing lived. The silence there would be deafening, wouldn't it? Hades had observed Persephone during his rare visits to the upper world, had seen the tender care with which she tended to the flowers, and something in his ancient yet solitary heart stirred. But how could the Lord of Shadows and the dead approach the daughter of harvest and life? How could he bridge the chasm separating the world of light from the world of darkness? The moment Persephone bent down to pluck this magnificent narcissus, the earth beneath her feet suddenly trembled. At first it was just a faint rumble, like distant thunder or a passing chariot, but then the ground split open with a roar, like the creak of a colossal door swinging open on ancient hinges, and from the depths rose a chariot drawn by 4 black steeds whose eyes glowed like embers in the night. Hades himself held the reins, his dark cloak billowing behind him like wings of night. With one swift motion he swept Persephone into his chariot, and before she could even cry out, they were already hurtling back beneath the earth. The chasm that had opened closed behind them, as if it had never existed. The only traces left on the surface were Persephone's scattered flowers and her overturned woven basket, lying forlornly in the grass. When Demeter discovered her daughter's disappearance, her grief was immeasurable. Have you ever experienced such profound sadness that you lose all desire to do anything? When food loses its taste, daily tasks seem meaningless, and caring about anything becomes impossible. This is what happened to Demeter, but on a scale that affected the entire earth. She stopped tending to the crops. She refused to bring rain. She ceased prompting seeds to sprout in spring. The world began to descend into cold and barrenness. Leaves on trees turned brown and fell, but no new ones appeared. Grass withered, flowers died. Even the olive trees, sacred to the gods, began to drop their fruits before ripening. Meanwhile, deep in the underworld, something utterly unexpected was unfolding. Persephone, having overcome her initial shock and fear, began to notice details in her new abode that surprised her. The walls of Hades' palace were inlaid with precious gems that caught and reflected the dim light in a way that reminded her of stars. Subterranean rivers flowed, creating their own mysterious music, and in gardens where the soil was rich with minerals from the very heart of the earth, strange, unseen, and beautiful flowers grew. Hades himself turned out not to be the monster she had expected. He spoke softly, almost shyly. He brought her previously unknown delicacies, fruits that grew only in the depths of the earth, sweet and extraordinary. He showed her the asphodel fields where the souls of ordinary mortals wandered in peaceful dreams. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything from her, but merely hoped she could understand the reason for his actions. And yet Persephone longed for the sun. She missed her mother. She missed the feel of warm earth beneath her bare feet, and the sound of birds singing in the mornings. However beautiful the underworld was, it was not her true home. On the surface, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Without Demeter's care, people began to suffer from hunger. Other gods pleaded with her to restore fertility to the earth, but she was adamant. "Return my daughter to me," she replied, "and then the world will bloom again, but not before." Zeus, the almighty king of the gods, finally had to intervene. He sent Hermes, the swift-footed messenger god, to the underworld to negotiate. Hermes found Hades sitting quietly in his garden with Persephone. Neither spoke, simply existing in that strange, timeless state people find themselves in when trying to comprehend something complex and profound. "She must return," Hermes gently told Hades. "The world above is dying." Hades slowly nodded. He knew this moment was inevitable. But then he looked at Persephone with eyes that reflected all the sorrow of the earth's depths. "I understand," he said, "but ask her, has she eaten anything while she was here?" This was a question of immense importance, for there was an ancient and unbreakable law. Anyone who tasted food in the underworld would be forever bound to it. Persephone cast her gaze down at her hands. That morning, while strolling through Hades' garden, she had seen a pomegranate tree laden with fruit. The pomegranates were unlike any she had ever seen, dark red like precious jewels, each seed sparkling like a tiny ruby. Almost without thinking, She plucked one and ate 7 of its seeds. They tasted of concentrated sweetness, like the essence of all fruits ever grown, encased in miniature spheres. 7 seeds, such a seemingly trivial thing to alter the fate of an entire world. Because of those 7 seeds, Persephone could not return to the upper world permanently. But Hermes, skilled in words and negotiation, managed to reach a compromise. For a portion of each year, 1 month for each seed she had eaten, Persephone would remain with Hades in the underworld. For the remaining months, she would return to her mother and to the world of sunlight and vibrant growth. And so it was decided, when Persephone re-emerged to the surface, Demeter's joy was so immense that flowers instantly bloomed wherever her daughter, Evite, trod. Spring burst forth like a peal of laughter, followed by summer with its abundance of growth and warmth. But when it was time for Persephone to return to the underworld, Demeter's grief brought autumn, when leaves changed colour and fell, and winter, when the world rested beneath blankets of snow. It is said that in the underworld Persephone became a true queen. She learned to help Hades justly judge the souls of the dead. She tended to the subterranean gardens which bloomed with flowers unseen by any living person, and gradually she grew to love this quiet, contemplative god who had so dramatically disrupted her life, yet treated her with such gentle respect. When spring returned each year, Persephone emerged from the earth, like the flowers themselves, bringing with her the memory of the depths and darkness, which made the sunlight even more precious. And Demeter welcomed her daughter home with such jubilant joy that the entire world celebrated her return with blossoming trees, singing birds, and the sweet scent of new grass. Even now, millennia later, you can still witness this ancient drama playing out in the changing seasons. Every autumn, as the leaves begin to turn, Persephone prepares to return to her underground realm. Every winter, the bare branch and dormant seed wait like Demeter for spring's return. And when the first crocus pushes through the snow, it is as if Persephone herself is coming home, heralding new life. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other ancient stories might be hidden in the everyday rhythms of the world around us? What stories do the seasons themselves still tell, if only we listen? Speaking of stories hidden in everyday expressions, have you ever heard someone described as having an Achilles heel? It's a common phrase we use when a very strong or talented person has one seemingly minor weakness. The story behind those words begins with an overwhelming mother's love and a desperate attempt to protect her child from a fate she couldn't even imagine. Thetis was a sea goddess, extraordinarily beautiful and wise, with hair flowing like ocean waves and eyes reflecting the bottomless depth of underwater caves. Having married the mortal King Peleus and borne him a son, she loved this child with all the fierce, instinctive protectiveness that mothers have felt throughout the ages. But, being a goddess, Thetis could see glimpses of the future, and what she saw filled her with unspeakable dread. Her son, Achilles, would grow to be the greatest warrior who ever walked the earth. He would be swift as a gust of wind, strong as a raging storm, skilled with sword and spear like no mortal. Poets would sing of his exploits for millennia, but he was destined to die young, struck down in battle while still in the prime of his youth. As we ponder fate, we can't help but picture Thetis, the sea nymph, holding her tiny son close. She feels his miniature fingers clasping her tightly, observes his serene sleep, unique to infants. How could she reconcile herself to the thought that this precious being was destined for such a short, brutal life? It was unthinkable. She had to try to change his destiny. And so one night, when the palace was deep in slumber and even the owls were silent, Thetis carefully wrapped her baby in soft cloths and carried him to the banks of the river Styx. This river was not merely a stream of water, it served as the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Its waters possessed extraordinary power. Anyone who bathed in them became invulnerable, protected from all harm. The river was black as a moonless midnight and surprisingly warm. It flowed silently, like a current of liquid stillness. Thetis waited until the water reached her waist. Then, holding her breath and whispering prayers to any gods who might hear her, she immersed her son in the magical waters. However, when holding a child, it is crucial to maintain a firm grip to prevent them from slipping away. Thetis held Achilles by his heel, her fingers tightly grasping his tiny ankle. The waters of the Styx covered every part of the child's body, except for that small area where his mother's hand shielded him from the river's touch. When she lifted him out, little Achilles was no longer entirely mortal. His skin had become like armor, capable of repelling any weapon. No sword could cut him. No arrow could pierce him. No spear could wound him. Thetis had succeeded in protecting her son, or so it seemed to her. Achilles grew up exactly as the ancient prophecies foretold. He was tall and strong, with golden hair that caught the sunlight like wheat fields on a summer afternoon. He could run faster than horses, fight longer than any other warrior, and his mastery of weapons was like deadly poetry. When he moved across the battlefield, enemies fled before him like leaves before a hurricane. But he possessed other qualities as well. He was kind to those weaker than himself, loyal to his friends, and surprisingly gentle for such a fierce fighter. He played the lyre beautifully, composing songs about heroes of bygone eras. He cared deeply for his comrades and wept openly when any of them were wounded or killed. In another world, he might have been remembered as much for his compassion as for his valor in battle. When the Trojan War began, a conflict destined to last 10 long years, all the greatest warriors of Greece sailed across the wine-dark sea to fight. Achilles went with them, leading his own contingent of warriors known as the Myrmidons. They were devoted to him not only because he was invincible in battle, but also because he treated them with respect and shared their hardships. For 9 years, Achilles was exactly what one would expect of an invulnerable warrior. He fought battle after battle, always emerging without a scratch, while enemies fell around him like wheat before a scythe. His reputation grew until the mere mention of his name caused enemy armies to falter. But then something happened that revealed another side of Achilles, the part of him that felt deeply. His closest friend, Patroclus, was killed in battle by Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy. Patroclus was more than a friend. He was like a brother to him, one who understood Achilles' heart beneath all that invulnerable skin. Achilles' grief was like a force of nature. He wept so loudly that his mother heard him from her palace beneath the sea. He refused to eat or sleep. He cut off his beautiful golden hair and cast it upon Patroclus's funeral pyre. And then, driven by a rage that was truly love turned inside out, he hunted down Hector and challenged him to single combat. The battle between Achilles and Hector was like watching a storm clash with a mountain. Both were incredibly skilled. Both were undeniably brave, but only one was protected by the waters of the Styx. Hector fought valiantly, but in the end Achilles' spear found its mark, and Troy's greatest defender fell. What Achilles did next revealed both his human heart and his terrible grief. Instead of treating Hector's body with the respect due a worthy adversary, he tied it to his chariot and dragged it around the walls of Troy. It was an act of desecration that shocked both armies and angered the gods themselves. For days Achilles continued this grim ritual, driving his chariot around the walls of Troy while Hector's family watched in horror from the city's ramparts. It seemed that by punishing Hector's body, he could somehow punish death itself for taking his friend. But in the end, Hector's father, old King Priam, did something that required more courage than any charge on a battlefield. He came alone to Achilles' tent in the dead of night, unarmed and unguarded, to beg for his son's body. The old man knelt before the warrior who had killed his child, speaking not as a king to an enemy, but as a father to another man who understood loss. "I have done what no other mortal has done," Priam said softly. "I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my son." Something in those words broke through Achilles' anger and grief to touch his heart. He looked at this elderly man, bowed with sorrow, and saw his own father, who would one day mourn him in the same way. He wept then, not tears of angry fury, but the cleansing tears of shared human pain. He returned Hector's body to Priam and declared a truce so that Troy could properly mourn its hero. It was one of Achilles' finest moments, showing that even the greatest warrior was, in the end, just a man capable of being moved by compassion. However, the war continued, and fate had not forgotten its claim on Achilles. In the final battles at the walls of Troy, as he fought with his characteristic skill and fearlessness, an arrow flew towards him. It was fired by Paris, Hector's brother, who was known more for his beauty than his bravery. Normally, such an arrow would have harmlessly bounced off Achilles' protected skin. But this arrow, guided by the god Apollo, found the single vulnerable spot on Achilles' entire body. His heel, the very place where his mother's fingers had shielded him from the waters of the Styx. It was such a small target, such an improbable wound, yet it was enough. The greatest warrior who ever lived fell because of his heel, the only place where his mother's protective touch left him mortal. In trying to save her son from his destiny, Thetis had inadvertently created the very weakness that would destroy him. As Achilles lay dying, he thought not of his many victories or his eternal glory, but of simple things. The feeling of sunlight on his face, the sound of his friend Patroclus laughing, the songs he would never finish composing. He thought of his mother and hoped she would understand that he had tried to live in a way that honoured the life she had given him, even if he could not make it as long as she wished. The story of Achilles reminds us that our greatest strengths and our deepest weaknesses often come from the same source, the love of those who care for us. Every protection has its limits, every gift has its price, and sometimes what makes us strong also makes us vulnerable. Even now, when we speak of someone's Achilles' heel, we recall this ancient truth. Everyone, however mighty they may seem, has that one small place where the arrows of fate can strike. Perhaps it is not a weakness, but simply part of what makes us human. The arrows of fate that found Achilles were not the only ones that forever changed history. Sometimes love itself can be the most dangerous arrow of all, as a young musician named Orpheus discovered on what should have been the happiest day of his life. Orpheus possessed a gift beyond ordinary talent. When he played his lyre and sang, flowers bloomed out of season. Rivers changed their courses to flow closer to his music. Wild animals sat peacefully side by side, lions next to lambs, hawks next to mice, all listening with the same dreamy contentment you might feel when someone hums your favorite lullaby. Even trees uprooted themselves and moved closer to hear him play. Imagine walking through a forest and seeing ancient oaks slowly shifting, like enormous gentle giants, their leaves rustling in time with a distant melody. Such was the power of Orpheus's music. It made the impossible natural, the magical mundane. When Orpheus fell in love with Eurydice, a wood nymph with eyes like spring water and a laugh like the chime of bells, his song seemed to become even more beautiful. He composed melodies that captured how sunlight played in her dark hair, rhythms that matched her graceful movement through meadows, harmonies that expressed all the wonder he felt just watching her tend to injured birds or gather wild honey. Their wedding day was so perfect it made one believe in the fundamental goodness of the world. The ceremony took place in a grove where wildflowers grew in natural circles, as if the earth itself had decided to celebrate. Orpheus sang a song he had written especially for the occasion, and as his voice rose and fell, butterflies danced around the couple like living confetti. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set and the celebration gradually gave way to the peaceful weariness that follows a perfect day, Eurydice went for a walk in the meadow. She wanted a few moments alone to absorb her happiness, to let it settle in her heart like honey in warm bread. She walked barefoot through the grass, still wearing her wedding garland of wild roses, when she stepped on something that stirred beneath her foot. A snake, disturbed from its evening rest, bit her ankle with fangs carrying deadly venom. Eurydice had time only to call Orpheus's name before she collapsed among the flowers that had just moments before celebrated her happiness. By the time Orpheus reached her, she was gone. Her hand was still warm in his, her face still peaceful, but everything that made her Eurydice, her laugh, her gentle teasing, her way of humming when he played, all of it had vanished like morning mist. For 7 long days and as many nights, Orpheus remained by the body of his beloved Eurydice, pouring out such profound grief in his songs that even silent stones seemed to shed tears. His music had always possessed an astonishing power over the natural world, but now it became an expression of pain so pure and all-encompassing that it felt as if it tore fissures in the very fabric of existence. Friends and relatives, consumed by sympathy, pleaded with him to eat, to find solace in sleep, to briefly distract himself from the oppressive sorrow, to care for himself. However, Orpheus was incapable of it. How could one partake in food when the one who filled life with meaning and taste had irrevocably departed? How could one surrender to sleep when every dream was filled with melodies that could never again be shared? Finally, an idea dawned on him, a notion so desperate and perilous that only a man driven mad by grief would dare to contemplate its execution. He intended to descend into the underworld itself and persuade Hades to return Eurydice. No living mortal had ever before penetrated the realm of the dead and returned. But Orpheus had his music, and music, as was known, could always accomplish the impossible. The entrance to the abode of the dead was hidden in a cave, delving so deep that sunlight never reached its furthest corners. As Orpheus began his descent, playing his lyre to illuminate his path not just with sound but with hope, the customary sounds of the underworld gradually hushed. The agonizing moans of the damned souls, the roar of the river Styx, the creaking of colossal gates, all fell silent to listen to his song. Even Cerberus, the fearsome three-headed hound guarding the gates to the world of the dead, lay down and whimpered softly as Orpheus played. The monster's 3 pairs of eyes, usually burning with unceasing vigilance, closed like those of a sleepy puppy. When Orpheus finally stood before the majestic thrones of Hades and Persephone, he performed the most significant song of his life. He sang of a love that transcended death itself, of the unbearable pain of separation, of a world that had lost its music with Eurydice's departure. His song was so beautiful, so full of genuine sorrow and profound love, that for the first time in many eons Hades shed a tear. Even the Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance whose hearts were believed to be harder than stone, found their cheeks wet with tears they couldn't remember ever shedding. Persephone, who understood better than anyone what it meant to be torn from the upper world, leaned over and whispered something in her husband's ear. Hades slowly nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, like any mortal overwhelmed by deep emotion. "Your music has touched our hearts," Hades said, his voice unusually gentle and full of compassion. "We will return Eurydice to you. But there is one condition. You must exit the underworld ahead of her. And you must not look back until both of you are in the sunlight of the upper world. If you turn to look at her even once before then, she will be lost to you forever." This condition seemed simple enough, almost elementary. Orpheus had already found his way into the underworld. Surely he could find his way out. He readily nodded, already envisioning the triumphant moment when he and Eurydice would step into daylight and resume their life together. The journey back began with a feeling of boundless joy. Behind him, Orpheus clearly heard Eurydice's familiar footsteps, the gentle sound of her breathing, the rustle of her wedding dress against the stones. Sometimes she hummed softly in time with the melodies he played to light their way, and that sound was sweeter than any music he had ever heard. But as they ascended higher and the path grew steeper, ominous doubts began to creep into Orpheus's mind. The footsteps behind him seemed so faint, almost ghostly. What if he was only imagining them? What if Hades had tricked him, and he was climbing alone while Eurydice remained below? What if she was struggling to keep up, growing tired, losing strength? The closer they got to the surface, the more these anxieties consumed his mind. He began to slow his pace, straining to hear any sign of her presence. Once, when the path was particularly difficult, he heard her stumble slightly, and he had to grip his lyre tightly to keep from turning around to help her. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours of climbing, Orpheus saw something that made his heart leap with jubilation. Ahead flickered a thin line of sunlight, marking the exit from the cave. They were almost free. Just a few more steps, and both would be in the world of the living again. But as he approached that strip of light, the doubts that had plagued him reached their peak. The footsteps behind him had become so faint he could barely hear them. What if Eurydice was still trapped in the shadowy realm behind them? What if she needed his help to cross this final threshold? Just as his own feet touched the sunlight, one step short of Eurydice being safe, Orpheus turned around. For one perfect, heartbreaking instant, he saw her. She was there, as beautiful as ever, reaching for the light and for him, but she was still one step inside the boundary of the underworld, and by looking back, Orpheus had broken the condition of her release. "Farewell, my love," Eurydice whispered, and her voice was full of deep sorrow, but not anger. She understood that he had turned back because he loved her, not because he doubted her. But understanding could not change the consequences. She vanished like morning mist, and this time there was no body to mourn, no grave to visit. She simply dissolved, returning to the realm of the dead, and the path behind Orpheus closed like water closing over a stone. Orpheus spent the rest of his life composing songs of love and loss, of the agonizing space between hope and despair. His music became more beautiful than ever before, but it was also immeasurably sadder, carrying the knowledge that some mistakes cannot be undone, some chances cannot be relived. He never again tried to return to the underworld. Perhaps he realized that Hades' mercy could not be asked for twice. Or perhaps he understood that some sorrows must simply be carried, transformed into something else, through the alchemy of time and acceptance. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice serves as a reminder that love sometimes asks us to do impossible things, like moving forward without looking back, like trusting what we cannot see, like believing in promises that seem too good to be true. And sometimes, even when we fail at these impossible tasks, the attempt itself becomes a kind of music that echoes in the world long after we are gone. Sometimes the echoes of ancient stories permeate our present in the most unexpected ways. Just as Orpheus's music lived on after his passing, so too has the whisper of a magnificent city, believed to have vanished beneath the waves long before recorded history began, persisted in human memory. The philosopher Plato first recounted the tale of Atlantis in his writings, describing it as a place that existed 9,000 years before his time. Whether he considered it historical fact or a kind of thought experiment about the rise and fall of civilizations, we may never truly know. However, the story he told was so vivid, so detailed, that people have relentlessly searched for Atlantis ever since. According to Plato, Atlantis was located on an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The island was vaster than Libya and Asia combined, and it was arranged in a series of concentric circles, with rings of land alternating with rings of water, like a target created from earth and sea. At the center of these circles rose the most beautiful city imaginable. Buildings were constructed from black, white, and red stone quarried on the island itself, and many were covered with brass, tin, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which glowed with a warm golden light. The palace at the heart of the city was a true marvel of engineering and art. Its walls were covered with silver, and its pinnacles with gold. Inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon, god of the sea, who was said to be the father of Atlantis' first king. The exterior of the temple was entirely covered in silver, except for the pinnacles which gleamed with gold, and inside was a massive statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses so tall that his head touched the ceiling of the enormous hall. But perhaps more impressive than the city's beauty was its sophistication. The Atlanteans created an intricate system of hot and cold springs that provided water for luxurious baths. They built harbours capable of accommodating ships from all the known world. They developed agriculture to such an extent that their island yielded 2 harvests a year. The people of Atlantis traced their lineage back to Poseidon himself, and for many generations they retained something of their divine nature. They were wise, just, and moderate in their desires. They cared more for virtue than for wealth, more for wisdom than for power. Their laws were inscribed on columns of orichalcum, and their kings met alternately every 5th and 6th year to discuss affairs of state and ensure that justice prevailed throughout their realm. For countless generations, Atlantis flourished under this system. Their ships sailed to distant lands, bringing back knowledge and goods, sharing their own innovations. They were skilled in sciences that other civilizations had not even imagined yet. They understood the movements of the stars, the properties of metals, the cultivation of plants that could grow in conditions other peoples would have found impossible. But over time, something began to change in the nature of the Atlanteans. The divine spark that was their heritage from Poseidon dimmed with each passing generation, diluted by intermingling with mortals and, perhaps, by the corrupting influence of too much prosperity and ease. Where once they had been content with sufficiency, they began to crave excess. Where once they valued wisdom, they began to value cunning. Where once they were generous to strangers and neighbours, they became greedy and territorial. The transformation was gradual, like a sunset, so slow that you might not notice it happening until you suddenly realize the light has completely changed. The Atlanteans began to look beyond their abundant island and see not potential friends and trading partners, but territories to conquer and peoples to subdue. They amassed a great military force and set out to conquer the Mediterranean. Their advanced technology and coordinated tactics made them almost unstoppable. One by one, ancient cities and kingdoms fell before their onslaught. But when they reached Athens, the city that would one day be Plato's home, they met unexpected resistance. The ancient Athenians, though vastly outnumbered and technologically outmatched, fought with the desperation of people defending their homes and the righteousness of those who refused to submit to tyranny. Against all odds, Athens not only repelled the Atlantean invasion, but launched a counterattack that drove the would-be conquerors back across the sea. It was as if the courage and virtue that the Atlanteans had lost had somehow taken root in Athenian soil. Deep beneath the waters, under the shroud of ages, a drama unfolded that sealed the fate of a great civilization. The true verdict on Atlantis was delivered not by mortal adversaries, but by the deities themselves. Zeus, the lord of Olympus, observed from his throne as the once noble Atlanteans transformed into insatiable, warlike, and corrupt beings. He decided that such a civilization, having lost its moral compass, had no right to continue existing. The end came suddenly, in just one day and one night. The island was rocked by powerful earthquakes, toppling majestic structures like houses of cards. Volcanic eruptions filled the atmosphere with acrid ash and fiery glows. But the most devastating was the rising sea which engulfed the land. The concentric circles that had been Atlantis's pride and protection turned into deadly whirlpools, dragging ships, buildings, and people to the bottom. The magnificent palace, the temple of Poseidon, vast libraries holding centuries of wisdom, harbours that welcomed ships from all over the world, all vanished beneath the encroaching waves, which closed over the island like a book shutting. When dawn broke, only a boundless ocean remained where flourishing land had been. The sea in that area became impassable, choked with silt and mud stirred up from the seabed. Ships attempting to navigate these waters became hopelessly stuck in what seemed like liquid earth, and sailors for generations reported the complete impenetrability of this region. This story could have faded into oblivion, forgotten like countless other tales of divine retribution and human folly. Yet Atlantis, in some inexplicable way, captured the human imagination with a force unmatched by purely historical accounts of ruined cities. Perhaps it was the striking idea that such an advanced civilization could vanish overnight. Perhaps it was the alluring prospect that somewhere beneath the waters, the ruins of this magnificent city still lay, awaiting discovery. For centuries, explorers, treasure hunters and dreamers have searched for Atlantis in the most diverse corners of the globe, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Caribbean to Antarctica. Some claim to have found evidence in underwater formations off the coast of Bimini. Others suggested that Atlantis is actually an echo of memories of Minoan Crete, destroyed by a volcanic eruption and subsequent tsunami. But perhaps the exact location is not the key. Perhaps Atlantis exists not as a geographical place that can be found with ships and diving gear, but as an elusive idea that resurfaces again and again in the human consciousness. It is the notion of a perfect society that destroyed itself through its own success, a civilization that reached such unprecedented heights that it forgot the values that originally elevated it. Every time a society becomes overly proud, too confident in its superiority, too ready to impose its will on others by force, the ghost of Atlantis whispers a warning. Every time people observe technology and prosperity without wisdom and self-restraint, they see the conditions that are presumed to have led to the demise of the most advanced civilization the world has ever known. Perhaps this is why people continue to search for Atlantis, not only in the fathomless depths of the ocean, but also in the rises and falls of civilizations throughout history. People keep looking for it because they are constantly recreating it, and they tirelessly need to be reminded that the price of greatness is humility, to remember where they came from and why they started this journey in the first place. The path to reclaiming lost grandeur often demands more courage than wisdom. This became evident to a young prince named Jason when he embarked on a quest for a treasure that seemed utterly unattainable. His expedition was to lead him to the edge of the known world, accompanied by heroes whose names still echo through the corridors of legend. Jason's story began with a family betrayal, as is often the case in ancient tales. His uncle Pelias treacherously usurped the throne that rightfully belonged to Jason's father, and when Jason came of age, he returned to reclaim his rightful inheritance. But Pelias, cunning as he was cruel, made Jason an offer that at first glance seemed generous, but was in fact carefully orchestrated to get rid of him forever. "I will gladly yield the throne to you," Pelias pronounced with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But first, you must prove your worth by accomplishing a great deed. Bring me the golden fleece from Colchis, and the kingdom will be yours." The golden fleece originated from a ram that once saved 2 children, carrying them to safety on its back, flying through the air with the same ease as a bird. When the ram was sacrificed to the gods, its fleece, shining like the sun itself, was hung in a sacred grove in the distant kingdom of Colchis, located on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. However, the fleece did not simply rest there, waiting to be taken like fruit from a tree. It was guarded by a dragon that never slept, never closed its eyes, never relaxed its vigilance for a single moment. This was not the kind of dragon one might encounter in a children's story. Huge, fire-breathing and dramatic in its menace. This dragon was far more terrifying because it was patient, perceptive, and absolutely dedicated to its task. The dragon coiled around the oak tree from which the fleece hung, its scales changing colour with the light, sometimes appearing golden like the fleece itself, sometimes dark like the shadows between the leaves. Its eyes were like polished amber, and they watched every movement in the grove with the focused attention of a predator that had all the time in the world. To reach Colchis, Jason would need a ship and a crew brave enough to sail through uncharted waters, filled with monsters, hostile tribes, and navigational hazards that had previously destroyed countless vessels. So he commissioned the building of a ship named the Argo, and called upon heroes to join him in what everyone understood would likely be a one-way journey. The response was astonishing. Heroes from all over Greece joined those who became known as the Argonauts. Among them was Heracles, the strongest of all mortals, capable of battling lions and diverting rivers. There was Orpheus, whose music could charm wild beasts and bring tears to stones. There were the twins Castor and Pollux, skilled in horsemanship and boxing, and Atalanta, a huntress who could outrun any man and whose arrows never missed their mark. Each hero had their own reasons for joining the quest. Some sought glory, others adventure. Some fled difficult circumstances at home, others pursued dreams they couldn't fully articulate. But all understood that this journey would test them in ways they had never experienced before. The voyage to Colchis spanned many months, and each stage was an adventure in itself. They navigated through the clashing rocks, colossal boulders that periodically converged, crushing any vessel unfortunate enough to be caught between them. They encountered harpies, vicious creatures with the bodies of birds and the faces of women, who tormented a wise old king by constantly snatching his food. They landed on islands where the locals had never before seen strangers, and they had to employ diplomacy as often as force to continue their journey. Sometimes the locals were hostile, sometimes helpful, but always they were filled with curiosity about these heroes who had sailed so far from home on such a perilous mission. When the Argo finally reached Colchis, King Aeetes received Jason and his crew with the suspicious hospitality that rulers extend to visitors who might be either valuable allies or dangerous threats. The king agreed to give Jason the Golden Fleece, but only if he could accomplish what seemed like impossible tasks. First, Jason had to yoke 2 bronze bulls that breathed fire and had hooves of copper. Then he had to use these bulls to plough a field and sow it with dragon's teeth. From these teeth would sprout armed warriors, whom Jason had to defeat before sunset. It was a test designed to kill him, and everyone understood this perfectly. The bronze bulls had trampled and burned every previous contender. The warriors grown from dragon's teeth were fierce, acted in unison, and were absolutely merciless. No mortal could possibly survive such trials. However, Jason found an unexpected ally in Medea, the king's daughter, skilled in magic and herbs. She had observed Jason since his arrival in Colchis, and something in his courage and his evident devotion to his quest touched her heart. Medea was no ordinary princess waiting to be rescued. She was intelligent, powerful, and knowledgeable about forces most people feared even to contemplate. Her magic could heal or harm, protect or destroy, and she decided to use it to help this foreign prince who had sailed so far to accomplish what everyone deemed impossible. She gave Jason an ointment that would protect him from the bull's fiery breath and bronze hooves. She revealed to him the secret to defeating the dragon-tooth warriors. Throw a stone among them so they would fight each other instead of him. And most importantly, she promised to help him get past the sleepless dragon that guarded the golden fleece itself. The trials unfolded exactly as Medea had predicted. Protected by her ointment, Jason was able to yoke the bronze bulls and plough the field. When the armed warriors sprang from the furrows, he threw a stone into their midst, and they immediately began to fight each other with such fury that they completely annihilated one another. King Aeetes was enraged that Jason had succeeded, but he could not renege on his public promise. However, he had no intention of actually giving up the golden fleece. He began to plot an attack on the Argonauts by night and to kill them all while they slept. Medea, possessing a deep understanding of her father's intentions, foresaw the impending betrayal and immediately warned Jason. That very night, she led him to the sacred grove, where the golden fleece rested on an ancient oak, under the ceaseless guard of the dragon to whom sleep was unknown. The creature seemed to sense their approach long before they reached the coveted tree. Its colossal head slowly rose from the coil of its scaly body, and a pair of amber eyes filled with sinister intelligence fixed upon the intruders. The dragon uttered no sound, no roar, no hiss, unlike lesser beings. Its entire menace lay in its absolute stillness, in its patient readiness for a lightning-fast strike. Then Medea began to sing. It was a song in a language older than Greek, perhaps even older than any human tongue. A lullaby. It appealed to the deepest, most primitive parts of the brain, to those sections that hold memories of serene childhood, of feeling protected and lulled in loving arms. The dragon's head began to sway almost imperceptibly, as if it were struggling with something utterly new and unknown. Its amber eyes, which had never known sleep before, grew heavy. The coils of its body loosened, and muscles that had been tense for decades finally began to relax. For the first time in its long existence, the sleepless guardian succumbed to slumber. Jason, trying to be as quiet as possible, barely daring to breathe, climbed the oak tree and reached for the golden fleece. When his fingers touched it, the fleece felt warm, as if the life of the magical ram from which it originated still pulsed within it. It was surprisingly light and seemed to emit an inner luminescence. Clutching the fleece tightly to him, Jason descended and followed Medea out of the grove. Behind them, the dragon slept, immersed in dreams no living organism before it could have experienced. The journey home proved no less perilous than the quest itself, now complicated by King Aeetes dispatching ships in pursuit to reclaim his daughter and punish those who had stolen his treasure. But that is an entirely different story, full of its own adventures and dramatic events. What is important now is that Jason accomplished the seemingly impossible. He obtained the golden fleece, a treasure guarded by a creature that had never known rest, never lost vigilance, never granted anyone the slightest chance to approach. Sometimes, the most formidable guardian can be overcome not by force or cunning, but by offering it what it has never had, in this case, the simple gift of sleep, the rest necessary for every living creature, but which this dragon had been denied due to the nature of its duty. This makes one wonder what other seemingly impossible tasks can be solved, not by fighting harder or being craftier, but by understanding what the guardian truly needs and finding a way to provide it, understanding what drives us to attempt impossible tasks. Heracles knew better than anyone, though his insight came at a cost that nearly destroyed him. His story reminds us that sometimes our greatest strengths and our deepest flaws stem from the same source, and that redemption often requires far more from us than we believe we can endure. Heracles was born with strength surpassing anything mortally possible. As an infant, he strangled 2 snakes sent to kill him in his cradle, and he did so laughing as if it were a game. As he grew, his might grew with him, until he could lift boulders that would challenge a dozen ordinary men. He could wrestle lions bare-handed, bend iron bars as easily as one might bend a flower stem. But with this immense physical strength came a temper that was just as powerful and far more dangerous. When Heracles fell into a rage, he didn't just raise his voice or storm out of a room like most people. His fury was like a force of nature, sudden, overwhelming, and destructive beyond measure. For years, Heracles managed to control this aspect of his nature. He married a woman named Megara, and they had children. It seemed he had found the peaceful domestic life that might tame the wildness in his heart. He was a loving father, gentle with his children despite his immense strength, and a devoted husband who strove every day to be worthy of his family's trust. But the goddess Hera, who had hated Heracles since his birth because he was the son of her husband Zeus by another woman, decided to shatter this happiness in the cruelest way. She afflicted Heracles with a fit of madness, a rage so complete that he lost all sense of who he was and what he was doing. When the madness finally receded, Heracles found himself surrounded by a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his insane fury, he had killed his own wife and children, the very people he loved most in the world. His strength, which should have been used to protect them, became the instrument of their destruction. The grief and guilt that followed were almost enough to destroy him entirely. For days he sat amidst the ruins of his former happiness, unable to eat, sleep, or even speak. How does one live with the knowledge that you have destroyed everything you hold dear? How does one continue to exist when the very thing you fear most about yourself has proven to be absolutely true? Finally, desperate to find a way to atone for his actions, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi. The oracle's prophecy was harsh, but it offered a thread of hope. Heracles was to serve his cowardly cousin, King Eurystheus, for 12 years, performing whatever labours the king demanded. Only by completing this service could he find purification for his terrible crime. King Eurystheus was exactly the kind of man one would expect to be given power over a hero like Heracles, petty, envious, and cruel. He was also clever enough to understand that Heracles' strength made him dangerous, and cowardly enough to desire the destruction of that strength, rather than its use for any beneficial purpose. Therefore, Eurystheus devised a series of 12 labours. Each was designed to be impossible. Each was intended to kill Heracles in some terrible way. If the hero somehow survived one task, the next was even more lethal. The first labour was to kill the Nemean lion, a creature with a hide so tough that no weapon could pierce it. Arrows bounced off it like pebbles, swords broke against its fur, spears shattered on impact. Heracles eventually had to strangle the beast with his bare hands. A struggle that lasted all day and left him exhausted but victorious. The second labour was to destroy the Hydra, a serpentine monster with multiple heads that grew back twice as many when one was severed. Every time Heracles cut off a head with his sword, 2 new ones sprouted in its place, until he was facing a writhing mass of snapping jaws and poisonous fangs. He solved this problem by having his nephew burn each neck stump with a torch immediately after Heracles severed a head, preventing regrowth. This was one of the few times Heracles accepted help during his labours, and it taught him that sometimes strength alone is not enough. You also need wisdom and cooperation. The third labour took him to the mountains to capture the Ceryneian hind, a deer sacred to the goddess Artemis. This task required not strength, but patience and persistence, as Heracles had to pursue the swift creature for a full year before finally capturing it without harming it, a requirement that made the task exponentially more difficult. Each subsequent labour brought new challenges that tested different aspects of Heracles' character. He had to capture the enormous Erymanthian boar alive, clean the Augean stables which housed thousands of cattle and had never been cleaned, drive away the man-eating Stymphalian birds, tame the fire-breathing mares of Diomedes, obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, Queen of the Amazons. Some of these tasks required diplomatic skills that Heracles had to develop. Others required cunning and planning rather than brute force. The hero who once relied solely on his strength gradually learned to use his mind, his heart, and his ability to work with others. But the most challenging labours were yet to come. The 10th task required him to steal the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant who lived on the western edge of the world. To reach Geryon's island, Heracles had to cross the ocean, and along the way he set up the Pillars of Heracles, now called the Strait of Gibraltar, to mark the furthest point of the known world. The 11th labour sent him to the garden of the Hesperides to steal the golden apples that grew there. These apples granted immortality to anyone who ate them, and they were guarded not only by the Hesperides themselves, nymphs who sang as they tended the trees, but also by a 100-headed dragon named Ladon. To accomplish this task, Heracles had to persuade the Titan Atlas to help him. Atlas, who held up the sky as punishment for his role in an ancient rebellion against the gods, agreed to fetch the apples if Heracles would temporarily take on his burden. So, for a short time, Heracles stood at the edge of the world with the entire weight of the heavens on his shoulders, learning what it meant to bear a responsibility that could never be put down. The 12th and final labour was the most impossible of all, to descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of the dead. No living man had ever entered Hades' realm and returned, and Cerberus had never been defeated by any hero or monster. But by this time, Heracles had changed from the rage-filled man who had begun these labours 12 years ago. He had learned patience from pursuing the Ceryneian hind, diplomacy from his encounters with the Amazons, humility from his time supporting the sky. When he approached Hades and Persephone and asked for permission to attempt to capture Cerberus, he did so with respect, not arrogance. Hades agreed to let him try, but with one condition. Heracles had to subdue Cerberus using only his strength, without weapons and without anyone's help. It was the ultimate test of everything he had learned during his years of service. The battle between Heracles and Cerberus was a grand event, yet surprisingly silent. There were no thunderous roars or dramatic postures, only a relentless struggle of might against might, endurance against endurance. Heracles wrapped his powerful arms around the necks of the enormous hound and held on tight. Regardless of how fiercely the creature thrashed, or how desperately it tried to shake him off. Eventually, Cerberus understood. This man would not release his grip, would not surrender, would not be intimidated or broken. Filled, perhaps, with a peculiar respect, the guardian of the underworld allowed himself to be led into the world of mortals. When Heracles presented Cerberus to King Eurystheus, the cowardly ruler, upon merely glancing at the three-headed beast, immediately granted Heracles his long-awaited freedom. Thus the 12 labours were completed, the debt of atonement was fully paid, and the hero was finally free to shape his own destiny. However, the crucial aspect of such transformative trials lies in this. Once completed, a person is no longer the same individual who began the journey. Heracles, having successfully accomplished his 12 tasks, was significantly different from the man who, 12 years prior, had embarked on them, tormented by grief and a sense of guilt. He came to understand that true power stems not from the ability to crush and destroy, but from the wisdom to discern when to refrain from using one's strength. He realized that the most ferocious battles are often waged not against external monsters, but against those aspects of one's own personality that evoke the least approval. And finally, he understood that redemption is not a destination one reaches, but rather a way of travelling, a daily choice to utilize one's talents in service of something greater than oneself. The 12 labours of Heracles serve as a vivid reminder that sometimes the trials that, at first glance, appear designed to crush us, actually reveal to us the true essence of our being and show us who we are capable of becoming. The question of who we can become was one that Sisyphus, in his own conviction, believed he had definitively answered. He was unshakably confident in his exceptional intellect, sufficient to outwit anyone, even the gods themselves. His narrative serves as a cautionary tale. There are contests where victory brings no desired outcome, and some triumphs turn out to be disguised defeats. Sisyphus, the ruler of Corinth, was widely renowned throughout Hellas for his exceptional cunning and sharp mind. He founded his state and brought it to prosperity by employing a unique blend of profound strategic thinking and ruthless pragmatism. This monarch always seemed to anticipate the actions of those around him by several steps, finding an advantageous position or a hidden benefit in any, even the most complex situation. However, Sisyphus possessed a fatal flaw. He could not resist flaunting his ingenuity, even in cases where prudence dictated silence and keeping his schemes to himself. Like an outstanding chess master, he couldn't help but demonstrate all his brilliant moves to his opponents, even if it led to the revelation of his carefully crafted strategy. Trouble began when Sisyphus inadvertently witnessed an event he should have ignored. Zeus, the supreme lord of the gods, transformed into a mighty eagle to abduct a river nymph named Aegina. Her father, the river god Asopus, searched everywhere for his missing daughter and approached Sisyphus for assistance. At that moment, it would have been far more prudent for Sisyphus to feign ignorance. After all, what mortal ruler would want to meddle in disputes between deities? But Sisyphus saw a chance to gain a powerful ally and could not resist the temptation to demonstrate the breadth of his knowledge. "I witnessed what happened to your daughter," Sisyphus declared to Asopus. "Zeus abducted her, but if you wish to obtain this information, I will require something in return. Create a source of fresh water for my city, and I will tell you where he took her." The deal seemed brilliant. Asopus indeed created a spring. Sisyphus divulged Zeus's secret, and Corinth was enriched with an invaluable water source. However, Sisyphus made the classic mistake of believing he could manipulate forces far superior to himself with impunity. Zeus, of course, was furious upon learning that a mortal ruler had betrayed his secret and set an enraged river god upon him. He decided to teach Sisyphus a lesson so that he would realize the danger of being too clever for his own good. Zeus dispatched the very embodiment of death to take Sisyphus and escort him to the gloomy underworld realm. Yet, even in the face of the inevitable fate decreed for all mortals, Sisyphus could not resist the temptation to outwit his adversary. When Death appeared at the palace in Corinth, Sisyphus greeted her with feigned submission. "I suppose my hour has come," he uttered with feigned sadness. "I am ready to follow you, but please, tell me about those chains you carry. What is the principle of their operation? I've heard they are indestructible, but I've never seen them up close." Death, filled with pride for her implements, gladly agreed to demonstrate. "You see, once these shackles are fastened, no power in the entire universe can break them. Here, allow me to show you how they clasp." And faster than Death could comprehend what was happening, Sisyphus locked the chains around the very personification of Death. With Death imprisoned, bound by her own unbreakable shackles, no one anywhere could die any more. Such an act constituted the gravest violation of the natural order of the world. At first, Sisyphus exulted in his ingenuity. He had managed to deceive the very embodiment of death. He had accomplished a feat no mortal before him had ever achieved. However, the consequences of his actions gradually became more and more apparent. Without Death to claim the elderly and infirm, the world began to plunge into an abyss of unbearable suffering. Those who should have found peace in death were condemned to continue their existence in torment and infirmity. Warriors who fell on the battlefield could not die. They lay with horrific wounds, unable to heal, yet also unable to find release. The deities were outraged, but more importantly, they were gravely concerned. The entire cosmic order rested upon the cycle of life and death. Without death to balance life, the very universe was threatened with complete destruction. Ultimately, Ares, the god of war, arrived in Corinth to resolve the situation. He freed Death from her bonds and personally escorted Sisyphus to the underworld. But even at this moment, Sisyphus still had another cunning trick up his sleeve. Before descending into the underworld, Sisyphus instructed his wife not to perform the proper funeral rites for him. Upon arriving in the realm of the dead, he immediately complained to Hades about this egregious violation of religious law. "My wife has disgraced me," Sisyphus declared with indignation. "She has not buried me properly. Can you truly expect me to remain in the underworld if I was not sent here in accordance with tradition?" Hades, known for his meticulous adherence to rituals, agreed that this indeed constituted a serious problem. He granted Sisyphus permission to return to the world of the living just long enough to arrange for his proper funeral. But no sooner had Sisyphus returned to Corinth than he had no intention of voluntarily returning to the underworld. He lived for many more years, enjoying earthly life and boasting about how he had outwitted death, not once, but twice. In the end, of course, old age caught up with him, and when he died a natural death, there was no escaping his inevitable fate. However, by that time the deities had concluded that ordinary punishment would be insufficient for one who had caused so much trouble and demonstrated such flagrant disregard for the natural order of things. Sisyphus was condemned to a unique form of eternal retribution. He was commanded to perpetually push a colossal boulder up a mountain. The essence of the trick lay in the fact that each time he nearly reached the summit, the stone inexorably rolled back down, forcing him to start all over again. Imagine this scene. Sisyphus presses his shoulder against the monumental stone, feeling its immense weight and rough surface, beginning his slow, arduous ascent up the mountain slope. His muscles strain to their limit. His breathing becomes ragged and heavy. Sweat streams, stinging his eyes. Step by step, inch by inch, he pushes the boulder higher up the incline. As he ascends, he sees the hilltop drawing nearer. Hope begins to stir in his heart that this time things will be different. That this time he will truly manage to roll the stone to the very peak. He pushes with redoubled effort, ignoring the pain in his back and shoulders, concentrating all his energy on overcoming the last few yards. And then, at the very moment he seems about to succeed, the boulder breaks free from his control and rolls crashing back down. Sisyphus is forced to watch as his hard-won progress vanishes without a trace. He must reconcile himself to the fact that all his titanic efforts were in vain. He must begin this agonizing process all over again. This punishment was perfectly commensurate with Sisyphus's character. He had always been driven by an insatiable desire to prevail, to surpass all others with his cunning, to achieve what was inaccessible to others. Now he found himself confined within a task where triumph was unattainable, where slyness proved useless, and where his keen intellect afforded him absolutely no advantage. However, it is precisely here that the narrative takes an unexpected turn. After countless centuries of ceaselessly pushing his boulder, an inner transformation occurred within Sisyphus. He began to discover a peculiar tranquility in this endless repetition, a rhythm that bordered on a meditative state. He started noticing details that had previously escaped his attention, how the lighting on the mountain slope changed throughout the day, the small wild flowers pushing through the stones, the sensation of his muscles working in concert to move the colossal stone. He began to take pride not in reaching the summit, which he well knew was impossible, but in the quality of his sustained effort, in the unwavering resolve of his will. Some thinkers have posited that in his eternal labour, Sisyphus discovered something that had eluded him in his life full of cunning and intrigue. It was a satisfaction that stemmed not from striving to outsmart others, or achieving impossible victories, but from simply yet honourably and persistently carrying out his task, regardless of the ultimate outcome. Perhaps the true punishment was not so much the endless work, but rather the realization of what his life could have been like had he earlier learned to find meaning in the process itself, instead of focusing solely on the end results. Or perhaps the punishment gradually transformed into a kind of gift, a chance to realize that even in the most hopeless situation, it is possible to find purpose and even a certain satisfaction. The myth of Sisyphus serves as a reminder that sometimes the very qualities that seemingly condemn us to eternal suffering can ultimately become the source of profound self-discovery and the attainment of inner harmony.